It's weird to walk by a black, foreboding cave in the middle of a residential neighborhood. As in, there's a row of lovely upscale residential houses. House, 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 dark, ancient cave, house, house. In fact, the street addresses just sort of skip it, the ones that are printed on the sidewalk. But I guess if you aren't sending mail to it or visiting it, maybe it doesn't need a street address. This particular black cave is in the neighborhood of Rehavia in Jerusalem. Kimmy and I lived a couple of blocks from this cave for a year in 2010. Anytime I was walking to the shuk, to the market, I'd pass by this cave. I walked up to the archway of the courtyard and I peered inside the cave once, although I didn't go in. I didn't see anything in the dark, but I imagine it probably was full of feral cats or worse, like other forgotten spaces in Jerusalem. Anyhow, I hadn't even thought about this cave for a good 5 years or so, until about a month ago. I was talking to my rabbi, Steve Sager. We were talking about a particular rabbinic story about ruins, and he mentioned that for him it evoked an ancient cave on a residential street in Jerusalem. I did a mental double take, like, oh, yeah, I know that cave. I brought up Google Maps, and I found it right there on Alfasi Street. I live the next street over, maybe a 2-minute walk from the cave. Now, Jerusalem is packed with ancient history. In that sense, it's very easy to live there and not even notice, have it pass you by. But after Rabbi Sager mentioned this cave down the block from me, I had to check it out. And naturally, this ancient cave has its own Wikipedia page. Turns out, as far back as ancient black caves on residential streets go, this one is really cool. I found that the abandoned site, with its ancient archways leading to this dark, foreboding cave, is the Kever Ya'ason. In English, the tomb of Jason. Curiously, no one has ever found a body there, but there's a short inscription on the wall stating, "Make a great lament for my brother Jason. Elder, rest in peace." Additionally, there are drawings of ships, which lead archaeologists to believe that Jason was a mariner, maybe a naval commander, or even a pirate. But ultimately, Jason's identity is lost to us, for this cave is dated to the 1st century of the Common Era. Jason lived 1900 to 2000 years ago. As I mentioned before, Kever Ya'ason, the tomb of Jason today, sits in a residential street. The kever wasn't filled in or destroyed to make room for new houses. And yet when I lived in Rehavia, I remember that just 2 doors down, the homeowners were in the middle of this major renovation project with building materials stacked out on the sidewalk next to the street. On some level, how weird is that? The burial cave right next to the front patio renovation. But they fit together. You don't destroy the kever, nor do you build on top of it. You find another way forward. It's really the only way in that sense. You don't walk through the kever on the way to the market spitting sunflower seeds as you go. So I never entered the kever. I wasn't called to it. A few archaeologists have, here and there. And additionally, the Israeli poet Dan Pagis was called to it. He wrote about it. He wrote, "Jason, that cunning old sailor, one of King Yanai's inner circle, pretends that he was buried far from the sea in an attractive grave in a holy city. Room within room he is hidden, adorned by pillars and arches. Peace and perpetual glory were carved for him in this limestone. The grave is empty, only the drawing of a ship scratched on the wall. Overhead kingdoms have fallen, new men have descended into Sheol, into the pit, but not Jason. He slips away again and again out of the blank wall in a fast ship. He cuts through the sea of air, maintaining radio silence, and with great profit, as always, smuggles very expensive merchandise, sunlight of water, velvet of sea breeze, marble of foam." For the poet Dan Pagis, Jason achieved a mythic escape velocity. He's transcended his own mortality, in fact. Kingdoms have fallen overhead, but Jason slips out again and again, this smuggler who runs these glimmers of life past the checkpoint of the confines of the grave. He's like Elijah the prophet, Elijah who lived in the Hebrew Bible, but never really died. He escaped to the heavens in a fiery chariot only to return and visit the rabbis, and accompany us in our Havdalah songs on Saturday nights, and slip in through our open doors to our Passover Seders each year. In the imagination of the poet, Jason, our unknown mariner, is one like Elijah who escapes the confines of his mortality in order to bring something to us, to teach us something of ourselves and our lives. I was struck when I found this poem about Jason with its similarities to Elijah, because the story that brought that cave to memory was actually a story about Elijah and a walk through the ruins of a Jerusalem neighborhood. Found in the Talmud Bavli, Tractate Brachot, the story is told by Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi said, "Once I was traveling and I entered one of the ruins of Jerusalem to pray. Elijah, always remembered for the good, came and waited for me at the entrance until I had finished my prayer." This is the same Eliyahu Hanavi, the same one who comes to our Passover Seders. He's waiting for Rabbi Yossi here. Rabbi Yossi said, "After I finished my prayer, Elijah said, 'Peace be unto you, my master.' I answered, 'Peace be upon you, my master and my teacher.' He said to me, 'My son, why did you enter this ruin?' 'To pray,' I replied. Said Elijah, 'You should have prayed on the derech, on the road, or on the way.' I responded that I was afraid lest the passers-by interrupt me. He said to me, 'You should have prayed a shortened prayer.' And so I learned three things from him. I learned that one does not enter a ruin, that one prays upon the way, and the one who prays on the way prays a shorter prayer. This business about praying a shortened prayer on the road makes sense to me. U405 doesn't necessarily seem conducive to spiritual experience, although our Rabbi Reuven spoke at beautiful length last night about the ways in which the road can be. But that you're not supposed to enter a ruin, that's interesting. Elijah continues in this story. He said, "My son, what voice did you hear in that ruin?" Rabbi Yossi just said that you're not supposed to pray in the ruin and goes so far as to even say not to go in it. But Elijah pushes him further. He knows that something dwells in the ruins. And he asked what sound was in the ruins, what voice was emanating from the ruins. There's something more complicated, in fact, about whether or not you go in. Maybe ideally you're not supposed to go in. You're not supposed to enter the ruin, but since you were there, what did you hear? Whose voice spoke to you in the ruins? This is the wisdom of the early rabbis. This goes back 15, 17 centuries. You don't pray in the ruins. You pray on the path. And that said, you still listen to the voices of the ruins. You aren't supposed to hang out in the ruins, but you do hear the call of the past. Now, a question I've heard in response to this is, what if your life is the ruins? What if you are authentically dwelling in the ruins? What if you're not on the path forward? What do you do then? I recall such an experience from when I was in rabbinical school. On May 31st, 2011, Hannah Staub committed suicide. She was 25. At that time, her father, Rabbi Dr. Jacob Staub, was my advisor at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. He remains one of my most important rabbis. Her brother, Andrew Staub, was a good friend of mine from even before rabbinical school who had just gotten engaged. His wedding would be the first I would officiate. When Jacob would speak of his daughter's suicide, he said that she had been sick for a long time with a serious disease, her mental illness, and that finally, at the end of her fight, it had taken her life. Jacob was quite open about the circumstances of Hannah's death, saying that he didn't want to hide it, he didn't want to cover it up, that it is indeed an epidemic, and it is something that we should be willing to speak of. Jacob was away for the rest of the summer, and he returned to the rabbinical college at the same time I returned from Israel. He's one of the deans of the college, and his return came at a time in my training when I would be studying his area most intensively. Furthermore, my classmates went to Israel at different times than I did or hadn't finished the previous year's work, and so for a variety of reasons, I was the only one in his class. When I think about this year I spent learning one-on-one with Rabbi Jacob Staub, I'm reminded of the story with Elijah and Rabbi Yossi, of Jason in the cave. This is a year that was torn between the ruins and the path. We read and discussed medieval Jewish civilization, and he taught medieval text and the Hebrew poetry of Shmuel HaNagid and Yehuda HaLevi. And we also talked about Hannah, and periodically about his son's upcoming wedding. That year, the path and the ruins were inverted. The present day held the ruins. Yet the conversation about the medieval violence and the Crusades, that was the path forward, in that was part of forming me as a rabbi, and it was part of Jacob returning to his life's work as a teacher and a rabbi. It was a course for both of us together in how you hold the unimaginable. We couldn't help but hear the voice of the ruins, even while trying to carve out some kind of a path forward, trying to articulate some kind of a prayer. A couple of years later, around when I graduated and was ordained, he said to me that during that year's shared journey, I was the rabbi instead of him. I appreciated the kindness of his words, but that wasn't how I remembered it. What I remembered is one of the greatest rabbis I know, who held the struggle and the sadness, the voices of the ruins, while searching and finding this strength to pray on the journey. And here's the wisdom of that rabbinic piece. I'm not sure there truly was prayer or the path forward within those ruins. At a certain point, you have to leave the ruins, even if the truth is that the ruins never totally leave you. I think about this with Jewish memory. We use the words never forget to describe our communal and collective experiences with violence. But the way forward is also not in the ashes. The rabbis express it right here. Those ruins that Rabbi Yossi entered, those were the ruins of Jerusalem. The destruction of the great temples. This was the cataclysm that engulfed Jewish life in the land of Israel, destroying the people, rupturing their relationship with God, and severing their connection with holy space. Rabbi Yossi, in turn, lived a century after this destruction of Jerusalem. The interval between his life and the Khurban is the same as the interval between my life and the Shoah, the destruction of European Jewry. His entering the ruins is not an innocuous act. He was drawn to the place, and he felt the need to be present. And even after rebuking him, Elijah understood. You don't go idly traipsing through the ruins, but if you are called to the ruins, you must hear the voices. You must hear the cries. You have to pay attention. You have to hold that sacred memory that calls to you from within. The rabbis suggest you don't pray from the ruins. You pray on the journey forward. And yet if you are called to the ruins, if you enter the ruins, you must listen to the voice with which the ruins speak. Elijah says to Rabbi Yossi, my son, what voice did you hear in the ruin? If you are called to that place, what does it say to you? What voice do you hear? I leave this question unanswered today. What did Rabbi Yossi hear in the ruins? That's for another day. We'll be seeing that piece of that voice. Whose voice was that? We'll return to this for Yom Kippur. But for now, I look for that way forward, that way of holding the memory and mystery of my neighbor Jason the seafarer, holding the illness and the pain of Hannah Staub, who died before I could meet her at her brother's wedding. We hold the memory and the voices of the destruction of the holy city of Jerusalem in the year 70. We hold the memory and the voices of the destruction of the Shoah from the 1940s. The reality is that we live among ruins. Even if you don't live in Rehavia and walk past the black cave of your neighbor Jason, you still live among ruins. We all carry remains. We all carry vestiges. We carry relics, carry shards. Sometimes these ruins are what we uncover when we visit those pieces of ourselves that are broken, the pieces of ourselves that have touched trauma and tragedy. I believe that all of us in this space understand what it means to live among ruins that are emotional and physical and ruins that are spiritual. It's not for us to forget our ruins, to abandon those parts that are broken through the inevitable experience of living life. And we don't choose the ruins either. While sorrow is a part of life, we don't choose it as a path. The Jewish people did not choose the Khurban in the year 70, and yet it's the truth for us to hear. When we are called to them, we hear the voices that speak to us, and sometimes these are the voices of others. When I recall my own vestiges, recall what it was like to grow up in the conflict of my own family, in and out of the courts, and in those particular ruins, the voice that I hear is my own when I was a child. And I know I shouldn't pray in those ruins. Every so often I visit them In my own memory, though, when I'm back in North Carolina, I know that there are photo albums that are perhaps best left closed. When I open them, I find myself pulled to the ruins and I can hear my own voice. And so I bear witness, but I don't pray. Prayer is a great many things, and to me in this case, prayer is what it means to build something new. It's to commit to the derech, to the path forward. No one in Rechavia built a home on top of Jason's kever. They didn't fill in that grave. And yet the fact of his kever didn't stop that city of Jerusalem from being born anew, finding life in our contemporary times, a life that shines centuries and millennia after the destruction of the year 70. The Churban is true. Jason's cave is true. And yet the living, breathing vibrancy of Jerusalem today, a place that hums with the electricity of prayer, that place is true as well. These things do not negate one another. It's not a zero-sum situation. But it's not simple. How do we hold the horrors of Jewish memory and simultaneously have the audacity to dare to build a Jewish future? How do we take the darkest part of our relationships with other people, the personal tragedies we hold, and yet return here to this space of hope year after year? How do we reconcile the ways that we suffer with the years that are marked with love and care, devotion to family and friends? It's sort of the conundrum of the journey. This very month, though, I was present with a family who experienced the sorrow of the death of a grandparent and the joy of a bat mitzvah in the very same week. In the real world, how do you possibly reconcile that? I learned something from this family about what it means to reconcile that which cannot be reconciled. And I learned it from a daughter of Ki who became bat mitzvah the week that her grandfather died. I asked if I could tell this story because within it I think there's something for all of us to learn. She said I was welcome to talk about it, but she didn't want me to use her name. She said if she was the only bat mitzvah student or bar mitzvah student I talked about, that she would rather remain anonymous. So I'll honor her, even though I honor the lesson she teaches. I'd been studying with this young woman for her bat mitzvah, and that week took a sharp turn when I found myself in the role of honoring her grandfather's memory. Following the funeral, the family had shiva minyanim over subsequent nights, and I led the minyan a couple of days before her bat mitzvah. That night, as I stood in the family's living room, we all recited Shema together. The young woman I speak of was seated next to me, and without having prepped her or asked her beforehand, on the fly in the middle of this service, I asked if she'd be willing to lead the Via Hafta prayer. Now, normally I wouldn't surprise a young person in such a moment by asking them to lead a prayer, particularly in Hebrew. But from what I knew from my time with her, I decided in this living room to trust in her and to trust in that moment. I asked her if she'd lead Via Hafta, and she hopped right up out of her seat. No problem. I had one of the Shiva prayer books in hand, and I offered it to her for the Hebrew or the English transliteration. She just looked up at me and she said, "I've got this." I love this moment. In the midst of her own sadness, holding her grandfather's memory, in the midst of holding the sadness of her father and that of her whole family, here she was, 2 days before her bat mitzvah, with all the accompanying joy and all of that stress, amidst all those swirling circumstances, the sadness and the joy, this young woman stepped into this loaded space, and she stood to lead her family in prayer. In that moment, I saw a daughter of Ki who intuitively and viscerally knows what it means to hear the voice of the ruins and to pray on the journey. Not only does she understand this, but that week she led other people in that Shiva Minyanim, and 2 days later at her bat mitzvah. The reality of it is that we're all part of this project of praying on the journey, building a Jewish future, and that we're joined together in listening to the voices of the ruins and holding sacred memory. We're called upon to stand alongside one another at those times when we pray on the path, called to stand alongside one another when we hear the voices of the ruins, sometimes the voice of others, sometimes your own voice, and sometimes the voices of those we love or our Jewish people. This is the truth of Elijah and Rabbi Yossi. It's the truth of my neighbor, Jason the seafarer. It's what it means to hold sacred memory, to live in holy community, and to build a Jewish future together. We listen to the ruins, and we pray on the journey. Shana Tova. Baruch Tiyeh.